I hope everyone can see it. If you have any issue, just say. James will be following in the chat, and we will take questions again with hands raised, or you can write it in the chat also. Yes, so the lecture I'm giving today is in ethics in sensory and consumer science. But as I said, first I wanted to say a few words about NOFIMA, because of course I'm not expecting that that people in Africa may have heard about a research institute in the other side of the world. So it's nice to say a few words. So we are a fairly big institution for Norway's size. We have 400 employees, and we research in food technology and also aquaculture. So these are our areas of research: fisheries, aquaculture, and food. And we do basic research, but most of our research is applied to the food and aquaculture industry. And these are all the areas we research on. I'm part of the Innovation, Consumer and Sensory Sciences group that is located more towards the south of Norway, in Os. It's 30 kilometers from Oslo, the capital of Norway. And in the InnoFoodAfrica project, there is also the processing technology group that is located in Stavanger, that is not part of this training, but they are participating in the processing work package in InnoFoodAfrica. In the sensory and consumer research group at NOFIMA, we have research in different areas of sensory and consumer research. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just for you to know what we do. So we try to kind of group the areas of we do research into sensory and consumer science for health. So we try to understand sensory perception at the light of trying to help consumers to make healthier choices. We have also an area where we look into sensory and consumer science for sustainability, where we support consumers in the transition to more sustainable diets, and also look into food choices and food waste in the households. We have also a lot of interest on sensory and consumer science on for individuality, and that is more looking into personalized food, meaning food for certain consumer groups that could be children, elderly, people on special diets, or also subcultures within the Norwegian food culture. And a lot of our research is focused on sensory and consumer method development, and our research group is quite well known worldwide for method development in the sensometrics area, meaning sensory and consumer methods and also statistics attached to them. And these are the lecturers that will participate from our research institute, NOFIMA, in the InnoFoodAfrica Training School. So me, that you are seeing already. Ingunn Berget, it's a researcher on data analysis and modeling, and she will be teaching on statistics for sensory science. Mats Erling Pedersen, it's engineer in the sensory and consumer science group and has a lot of hands-on experience on sensory, particularly descriptive analysis, but also consumer testing and so on. And Einar Risvik, senior researcher in the innovation group, he just retired, but contributed quite a lot on the preparation of some of the lectures that James will teach later on. Yes, so now we go to the topic of today, ethics in sensory and consumer science. And you can write questions, as I said, but it's also fine to interrupt if you have questions. James and Maris will follow the chat, so if you want to ask something throughout my lecture, you can stop me. So the learning points of today, we will learn on ethical and data protection perspectives that should be considered when collecting data with human participants. Within that, we have sensory and consumer science. So we will focus on sensory data, consumer data, and a bit on special populations. So this is really in a nutshell what Riet was telling you the previous lecture. Sensory and consumer science can be divided in two big areas. Analytic sensory methods when we use trained panels. So trained panels are used to use like an instrument. So we use subjects to detect and to measure. But even if it's a trained panel, we are working with human subjects, so we need to take into account their rights regarding use of their data for research. And then there is the area of affective methods, so consumer tests, where we collect data on liking, on preference, we do qualitative approaches like interviews and so on. And again, we are then handling data that we collected with humans. So what are the implications of that? So when we work with a sensory trained panel, this will be like in descriptive analysis that Riet was referring to. There could be two cases. If there is a work contract, meaning that we are using subjects that work for our company or for our research institution or for our university, then they are, of course, under a contractual relation. And then the work contract should include the conditions, or there should be a discussion with the panelists or the assessors on what are the requirements and what are you going to do with the data that you collect with this sensory trained panel. However, if we are working with a sensory trained panel and this is an external panel, meaning that we recruit people from outside the industry, the university, the research institution, then we are under the same requirements as with a consumer panel. So I will mainly refer to consumer panels throughout the lecture, but please have in mind that also for trained panels that are not employees, then we have exactly the same requirements. Of course, first of all, food samples should be safe for consumption, microbiologically, toxicologically, and approved as food under the regulations of the country. So either it doesn't matter if it's an employee, so they because of the contract they need to taste our samples. We need, as food scientists, we need to be sure that these samples are safe. This is very important. Consumer panels. So now we are going to talk about ethics, and every time we invite people to be part of a panel, as I said, even if it's either if it's an external sensory panel or a consumer panel, so we are inviting them to participate in research. So as such, they have the right to know of what are we going to do with the data, what are the objectives of this research, and how are we going to handle their data. So they need to receive enough information about the test they will participate in. So they need to know general objectives of the study, who would be the responsible for the study, so the researcher in charge of the study, the tasks they will be asked to do during the test, how the data will be utilized, and how the data will be stored. I will say a bit more about that. So what do we need to consider? We need to give information, as I was saying, to the consumers, to the participants, and participants need to give their consent before the test starts. There should be no risk for the participants. As I was mentioning, a sample should be safe for consumption, but other risks are also to be considered. For example, that their data are not used for other things, and particularly that their personal data are not used with other purposes, for example, publicity or selling databases and so on. So the participation in the testing should be voluntary. And in this case, one recommendation is that too big incentives should be avoided. So, of course, in consumer tests, we usually give incentives to consumers for participation. It could be that we pay them for their contribution, or could be that we give some gifts that could be products, or could be cards that they can exchange for example, food in stores. But we don't want participants in general that they are there only because of the incentive, because then the results could be biased. But of course, as it was discussed in the previous lecture, we shouldn't ignore reality, and there could be people that are suffering from hunger, that are driven to participation into consumer testing because of the incentives, or even because of the food we are giving them. So this is something that we should have in mind when organizing the testing. In some countries, for example, it's also forbidden to give incentive for medical research. So in this case, participants should participate only because of their voluntary interest in giving their time or participating as test subjects. But for sensory and consumer science, it's usually allowed and good to give incentives to participants as a token of thanks. Participants in consumer testing are always free to withdraw at any time without providing a reason and without any penalty. So this is something that the subjects should know in advance, that if they feel uncomfortable, they don't like the samples or whatever reason, they can leave the test and they don't need to explain why. I know this could be annoying for researchers, and it could be an issue because we need to recruit more people for the test, but we need to know that this is within their rights. And a very important issue is the protection of personal data. So for example, in Norway, we have the NSD, that is the Norwegian Center for Research Data, and it could be that in your countries there are specific institutions that look at data protection. And we will talk a bit more on that. So I said we need to give information and consent. So what does it mean? This is taken from the European directive on this is the definition of informed consent. And I'm talking about European legislation here, because I think, of course, in the different countries in the world, legislation is very variable. In some countries it's less requiring than in others, but I think nowadays the European legislation is probably the most requiring, and it's being taken up in many countries in the world. So for example, Norway is not part of the European Union as such, but as part of the European Economic Area, we use the legislation on data protection from Europe, and I know many countries outside Europe are taking it as their own also. So informed consent is the decision with must be written, dated, and signed to take part in a clinical trial, taken freely after being duly informed of its nature, significance, implication, and risks, and appropriately documented by any person capable of giving consent. So this is important, because what is a person capable of giving consent, we are going to say a bit later. But for example, children are not capable of giving legal consent. So then in this case, by his or her legal representative.
Hi, Paula.
If the person, yes?
I don't know if you stopped sharing your screen, because now we are only seeing your camera, not the slides.
Okay, that's strange. I see. Yeah, that is stopped. I didn't press anything, but somehow you see it now again?
Yes.
Yes, yeah,
Good.
now we can see.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, if the person is unable to write, oral consent in the presence of at least one witness may be given in exceptional cases, as provided for in national legislation. So as I mentioned before, I don't know exactly in the different countries in Africa what is required in this case. For example, when we are talking about low literacy people that are unable to write, if they are required of, for example, a witness, or if the researcher can be act as a witness in this case. So this should be a bit, of course, it's a bit boring in our course that we are here for the science and we are talking about legislation, but it's very important to know that we are treating with human subjects and that we need to respect their rights. So they are our research material, but they are human beings that they should be respected in their acts. So what do we need to give them regarding information? So basic things we need to inform them is duration of the test, even in online surveys. You may have seen that many online surveys say, okay, can you do this survey? It will take you 10 minutes or it will take you 20 minutes, or some of them even have a timeline at the bottom, so the subject knows how much will they take. If there is a tasting of products to be tasted, the ingredients, particularly if there are allergens or intolerances. So people should know if there is something they cannot consume. Also, if it entails risks, for example, we many times do prop testing. Prop is a substance that has a bitter taste and that we usually use to classify subjects regarding the sensory sensitivity. Prop testing is being classified as a risky substance because in certain concentrations can if consumed, can be a generator of certain cancers or tumors. So this needs to be informed to the participants. We need to be extra careful with vulnerable populations because, for example, children, because of not being still able to consent legally, but also pregnant women or elderly or sick people that could have more risks depending on what they are tasting. Also, consumers need to be informed about how are we going to manage their personal data. Where will we store it? For how long we will keep them? And who has access to that data? It's only, for example, the people related to the research and who is responsible. And we need to be particularly careful with photos, video, or voice recording in the case of, for example, interviews. So, as I said, we need to give this information for any consumer testing. It could be a tasting, acceptability study, a survey, a focus group, an interview, any consumer testing. We need to inform participants beforehand about that. It's good if this information is written for adults that can read, so they can keep, for example, a sheet and can come back to it and read it again if they have that. If we are working with children, even if the test is in a school setting, we need to give information to their guardians in advance. And it's in Europe, they ask for it, and we have been working with children for a while, and we think also it's very important to have an information sheet adapted to children so they can also read about it. It can be written, and also it can be a very simple information sheet that has some drawings and that it could be read to them, so it's oral information. If we are talking about an anonymous online survey, it should be information on the first page. So people, when they go in, they can see what is the test about. Of course, how much information do we need to give about the test? It's something we will talk in the next slides. So this, I said, there are two parts of the ethical perspective that we need to have, and it's information and then consent given. Now we will also introduce the concept of assent. So it could be consent or could be assent, and that is a legal difference. So adults, when they come to the lab, they need to give their consent, and this is a legal term. It's their agreement for participation, and that needs to be signed. Or, as I said before, if the person cannot write, we need to have an oral witness consent. If it's an anonymous online survey, there should be information of the first page, and then there should be a box for they to agree. Do you agree to participate? Yes. If they put no, they should be taken out of the survey, and it should be a possibility to stop at any time without saving answers already given. So even if a person is participating in an online survey, they should have the right to stop at any time, and they may be stopping because they don't like what they are asked. For example, some people could be offended by some questions or don't like certain questions, or if particularly if we are asking about values, attitudes, etc. So the person should have the right to leave the survey or test at any point in time. Special populations may not be able to give a legal consent, like children or like elderly with cognitive deterioration. And in this case is when we talk about assent. So their legal guardians, they need to sign the consent, but these children or elderly anyway need to give their own agreement to participate, and that's called assent. So children cannot legally consent because of their age, but they should be asked for their agreement to participation. This can be written if they can write and read, but if not, for example, preschoolers should be oral. So even if their parents signed, if we are in school with them, when they come to us for making the test, we need to ask again, do you want to participate? Yes or no. And again, there should be voluntary basis and freedom to withdraw at any time. And this also should be stressed to children. Of course, we can, if it's very small children, we shouldn't scare them, but we should make clear that it doesn't have any consequence if they stop. So here I have an example of an information sheet for 9 to 11 years old. This is an information sheet that has been sent to the children and the guardians, so the parents or legal guardians. And this was for part of the research of one of my PhD students, Martina. She's working with children in this age group. And as we see in the invite, it says invitation for a focus group about melon malted that are afternoon snacks. And it says, dear child and parent, this is an invitation to participate in a focus group where we want to find out what you eat as an afternoon snack. We want to discuss with you about the food you eat, how you perceive it, and if you have ideas for new or improved snacks. We will play games and we use creative techniques to get to the results, hoping it will be fun and engaging for you to participate. We are researchers from NOFIMA, and your participation will help us with an international project where, among other topics, we investigate in the preference for food in children and how to measure them. For more information, you can visit our website. So you see, this is explained in an easy language that children from 9 to 11 would be able to understand, because they have the right to know what is the objective of the research. So it has some instructions on what they need to do before the test. They need to sign the consent, both the participant and the parent, and they need to prepare some material. So we were, for example, asking them to take pictures of their usual snacks. So if you see here in point 2, please take 3 pictures of the melon malted, that is snack that you normally eat. Once you have taken the picture, log in on this online questionnaire, etc. So then also when it's happening, and some contacts in case they have any questions. So the consumer, that is the children and also their guardians, should be able to make questions before signing if needed. And the second page is the agreement, so the consent and assent. In this case, as it's children from 9 to 11, they are able to read and write, so we ask for the signature there and then. And we see that we also add the conditions. The legal basis for processing your personal data is parental consent, so they know they need the consent to be able to participate. And also we put what are the rights regarding the store data. This is a requirement by the European regulation. As long as you can be identified in the data material, you have the right to access to the personal information we have registered, to have personal information corrected, to have personal information deleted, or to receive a copy of your personal information, and also to send a complaint if that is relevant for them. So you see, information we give is quite thorough. So they need to know everything in advance, particularly when we are working with children. In this case, this research, they were focus groups, so the children were brought to us in the research institute. So in this case, they were contacted through some sport groups they participated in, so swimming groups or football teams. So one of the parents of the children, they were bringing the children to us. So I think in this case, it was quite clear that they were participating in a test, and the parents were well informed. However, when we go, for example, to a school class to make tests, or we have also in this research interviewed children during the visit of a science museum in our city. So we are going to the school class or to a group. In this case, it's important to make sure that the parents received the information, because it's also important that the parents agree to the fact that they are participating in a research. There are many consumers that are very happy to help in research if the research is going to be used by research, for example, in a university or in a research institution, but not that happy to participate if if it's going to be used in an industry to develop products. There are some consumers that have this opinion, so they should be able to decide for them and for their children. So what information we need to give to consumers? Is it possible to give all information? No, we cannot tell everything about the research, because it could first induce expectations and also create, in some cases, desirability bias. What does it mean is that if we are, for example, doing interviews on how to promote healthy eating, if we say that we are looking into how people design their menus and from a nutritional perspective, because we are interested in how healthy people eat, then most probably they will have that in mind and they will give the responses we want to hear, like they eat healthy. However, we can say, okay, we are going to ask you about how you decide what to have for dinner at home. We will talk about how your family share the responsibilities at home and what kind of foods you prepare and where do you buy. So you are really saying that what are you going to talk about, but not necessarily what are the purposes of that, not to bias them or create expectations if there are products that they are going to taste. If we say too much information about the products, for example, there are some that contain high fiber in the form of beta-glucan, then maybe they are wary about, okay, what is beta-glucan? Should it taste bad? Or so then we create expectations that could be biasing. So we need to give brief and truthful information, but not too much information. Also, it's not possible to give information when you are organizing a randomized control trial, because in this case, consumers come to your lab and some are assigned to a test and others are assigned to a different test. That it could be intervention and non-intervention. So in this case, again, you cannot give the complete information of what they are going to do, but you can give some information that is very general, and in any case, maybe give more information at the end of the experiment. So this is about information and consent, but also, of course, when we run a consumer test, we should search for ethical approval of the protocol before we run the test. Usually, if we work for a university or a research institution, we would have an ethical board, or we can have an ethical board in the university or an ethical committee. And for example, at NOFIMA, we have approved or ethical approval for sensory and consumer testing in general. So for example, that we give samples to people to taste and so on. So general procedures. But every time that we run a specific test, we need to search and register the protocol with the Data Protection Office. So this is looking more into what are we going to do with the data and what kind of data we ask for. If some of the, it's not usually the case in consumer testing, but if we are also looking into medical and health issues, for example, if we want to know how certain food is metabolized and we are taking samples of blood, that could be a case, or if we are looking into genetics and sensory sensitivity, it could be that we take samples of saliva, etc. So in this case, we also need ethical approval from medical and health committees. And that is a bit more complex, but still we need to do it. So in Norway, for example, we have a data protection office, and we have also a regional committees for medical and research ethics. And I put you here this highlighted in red, because this could be useful for everyone, because in this regional committee for medical and health research ethics, with you have the link here, they also have some templates in English for information sheet for children, for youngs, for adults, that maybe they could be useful for you just to have as a base for generating your own templates. So I recommend you to go there. That could be of use. So we are talking about personal data. What actually is personal data? So personal data is any information related to a natural person who can be identified, and this identification should be either directly or indirectly. So of course we say, okay, this test is anonymous, we don't record your name, but it could be that we are doing a survey and our data collection software is recording the IP address of the computer. And that is also personal information, because theoretically someone could identify who has answered to that. So we need to be sure that everything that makes a subject of our research identifiable, we need to be very clear what are we going to do with the data. That doesn't matter that we cannot ask for a name or an email or an address, because maybe we need that to follow up. So in many cases, we have consumer tests where we want to reach the consumers twice, so that we invite them to a first test, and then we want to follow up with more questions, or the test is divided in two parts. So then we need to put all that data together, and for that we need a name or we need a code. And that's fine, but we need to be very clear to consumers, what are we going to do with that? So for example, a good practice would be that, okay, the name or whatever personal data identification we have, we save it until we have all the results. And after that, we anonymize the data and delete the personal data. And then we just have a file where we have consumers from 1 to 100, and we don't know the names or the addresses or the IPs. We just know maybe gender, age, and the few data that we need for our study. Also, we need to be careful with other things, like, for example, video recordings, voice recordings, because that also make people identifiable, or pictures. Or, for example, if we run focus groups and then in our report we have this person is a female from 68 years old that works in pottery. So maybe if we have the town, the age, the gender, and the job that this person does, this person is already identifiable, because maybe in that town there is only one lady of 68 that works with pottery. So then we also need to be careful with that. So whatever information that makes that person identifiable, we need to delete from our databases. This is a right of the consumer, and that's the only reason, of course, we need to know, but it could be that in some cases it could be dangerous for a consumer. Imagine it's a child that their parents are divorced, and maybe one of the parents has an order that cannot get close to the child, and maybe this family is in a way has moved because this child is in danger. So then if we have this information made available, it could be dangerous for that child. The same can happen, for example, if a woman is under violence at home and is trying to escape. So there could be issues also with data protection, that is because a person could be in danger. So we really need to be quite careful with the personal data. And it's good, as I was saying a few things, like why do we need to be careful with data protection? And you can read a bit more in the data protection principles of the European GDPR law that is from 2018 and is quite strict. And we, those of us that our countries have taken that as own law, we needed to make a lot of changes in our procedures to really abide with this law. And the principles is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So people has the right to know what are they doing. Purpose limitation. One thing is that we use the research for the research purpose. Another very different thing is that we sell, for example, the data, or that we use it for commercial purposes, etc. Yeah, I think that is the most important for the person, but of course regarding their confidentiality, their privacy, or what we were talking about. Also, accountability is important because we are researchers and we need to be accountable for what we do. So this is a responsibility we have that is not a small responsibility in a way. So I already started saying a few things about data storage. If possible, always record anonymous data. So if we don't need the name, we don't need to ask about the name from the start. However, if we need it, as I was saying, for contacting the person again, we can do it, but we need it to be very clear what are we going to do with that. So if not possible, pseudonymize data and stored separately as shortly as possible, and having a decryption key. So no names in a data file. When we have where we have the data from our research, names shouldn't be there. We should have a secure storage, in particular for sensitive data files. Usually not on a laptop, so it's better that the consumer data, and if we have personal data, is stored in a PC and in a secure server. a safe internal network, and the access should be limited to the persons involved in the project. Or should be a folder that is not accessible to other people in the research group or university. There should be also very secure storage for audio recordings, photos, videos, and questionnaires. So one of the things that is not allowed, for example, by European regulations, is use mobile phones for recording interviews, because then mobile phones, it's very easy to send that by mistake to others, or to be attacked by hackers. So it should be like recorders for recording a session and so on. So these are examples from our children consumer testing. We see here is some pictures that have been published in a master thesis from one of our students last year. So here we see some picture of children. Two of the researchers, you see that we blurred the faces that were visible, and you see the figure caption. A class of fourth graders doing the explicit part, faces are blurred for anonymity. So we say fourth graders, we don't say fourth grader of this school in this town, because then this is will be online. It's very unlikely that someone will be looking into pictures one by one. But if there is a key for being able to Google this, or look for it, and there is the grade of the school of the town, then these children could be localized, which is not, we don't want. And in this case, you see, we have published some faces of two girls. In this case, this master thesis was about face recognition. So it was interesting to show this, to show the type of emotions they were showing. And in this case, it was permit granted by parents and by the children, because the face was recognizable. So they had to give their express permission for the use of the picture in a master thesis report. So, any question? How is it the time? We still have 15 minutes, so very good. Probably, as I said, not the most interesting class, because it's a lot of legal things here and things that maybe we haven't wondered about, but it's very important to have it in our minds when designing our research. So James, do you see, is there some question?
Yes, Paula, I see one question here which says, it's from Uma. It says, if they are employees for other duties and they are being incorporated into an institutional sensory panel, which is out of their normal duties, how do you handle that?
So that is what I was referring to in one of my first slides. If they are employees, that this is in the contract, then that's there and it's solved. If this employees that is not reflected in their contract, again, they are acting in voluntary basis as consumers in our test, or as sensory assessors in descriptive analysis or whatever, but they are acting again in voluntary basis. So everything it's under the same rules. Of course, if some of the employees always do the same tests, let's say, for example, we are doing a triangle test or a descriptive analysis, and they are always participating in the same type of test, we don't need to give them all the informed sheet every time, or asking for their signed consent. But we can prepare a sheet at the beginning of the project and say, okay, you will be this, attending to this kind of testing. This is the information. It could be also oral information. Do you agree to participate? Yes or no? And we record it. And then we are safe. Of course, if they are employees, they are closer to us. They can ask if they have questions, but also it could be a very tricky situation, because they could feel pushed to participate because of being employees. And maybe some employers also have a requirement that is kind of an unwritten rule. So I think it's important also, I think it's also important for the researchers to know that they are happy to participate. Because if you have unhappy panelists in your panel, probably it's not the best thing to to have. So I think it's important to have the conversation also for us as researchers. We want that people are happy to participate. Yes, I see a hand raised there, Nosuko.
Yes, it's Nozuko here from South Africa, Zushi Innovations. So what I would like to know, Paula, is if you're a private company and you want to conduct consumer research and you want to somehow have an approval, ethical approval of the protocol that you want to conduct on the consumer study, and you want it validated, which institutions or maybe bodies or committees can one use to ensure safety, efficacy, and also now just understanding that with the current promulgated legislation around the ISO and validation of descriptors used on front of pack and requiring research to support that. How can one, channel that avenue in ensuring that the data that the study and the data has gone through the filtering of the ethical approval protocol?
Yeah, I think, of course, I cannot answer to the first part because that depends on the country. So I think you should, maybe this is something that in InnoFoodAfrica we could look a bit more into. Now we are looking, for example, into different country profiles and how to do consumer research in the different countries. I think it could be very good also to look for the ethical requirements and investigate a bit more in each country what are the possibilities for ethical approval of protocols. That would be very, very good, because in the different countries you may have different legislation and different bodies. As I said, for example, here in Norway we have this data protection office. It could be that you have somehow the same kind of office in your countries, so you would need to look at it, but this is more from the data protection side. But of course also you need to see that your protocol follows ethical also requirements. And I guess for this, maybe some universities are looking into do this kind of approval. So I don't have an answer, sorry about that, but I think InnoFoodAfrica could look into that and try to come up with answers to that for the different countries, at least in the project. But I also know there is a Sensory and Consumer Science Association in Africa that also could maybe look into that. I think it's very important and relevant question. Thanks.
Thank you, Paula.
So while you think more questions, I also have some questions for you. So if you have a mobile phone with internet connection, you can have it ready. Otherwise, I think you can do it also in your computer. So I will share with you first of all. So I have a couple of questions for you. I will share my screen in a minute. Yes, do you see my screen? So I'm asking, write the first 3 words that come to your mind when you think about ethics in sensory and consumer research. So you need to go to www.menti.com and you will be asked for a code that is here. So you input the code. You can use your phone if you have internet access, or you can use your computer. Do you see the code? Yes, very good. I see that you are. Very good. 6 participants. I think we are almost 50 in the meeting, so I'll wait a bit more to get more input from you.
Could I make a question while we wait?
Yes, please.
I like the protocol that you explained. At first it was send pictures of your food, and then that was like the first part, and the second one is actually going to the focus group. They give consent, but then they say they can't go to the focus group. Can you still use the information you had, or is it like not ethical to not have the two parts of the?
Well, in this case, of course, there were very few children because we ran 3-4 focus groups in total with 8 to 8 children around each. So it's very easy to manage in a way. So we didn't have that case. I guess as in this case, we were recording names to be able to follow those parts. So if I wanted to use those pictures for something, me as researcher, I would contact this person, this parent, and say if I can use that the first part in a way, because they gave consent. And of course, in this case, we wanted the pictures to discuss with them afterwards. So probably, in fact, it's not so important to have them, but if I wanted to have them because it's very interesting what I got, I would go back and really double check that these parents are okay. In this case, also it was pictures of food, so it was not pictures of the participants at all. But it's yeah, I think in that we always need to check with the respondent if we can.
Thank you.
Also something while we are responding, I can say a few things more. So this law, it's been from 2 years. We also had a lot of protocols before, but now we need to be much more following up every thing. And this, for example, information of when we are going to delete the personal data. Before it was not required by law, now it's required. So we, at the beginning, we were coming up with dates that were really, in the end, we were difficult to follow up, in the sense that we say, okay, if the focus groups are in August, we say that we will delete the data by December. But then if there is some delays, etc., then you end up being in a lot of stress because you need to do all the data processing to delete the personal information, and maybe you don't have time. So it's very important to put timings that are realistic and give you time to process the data. And I think it's not so important that this date is very close in time. That is more important that you do it so it's written and you are complying with it when you need to, so that the consumer is safe that you are going to delete their information, and you say when you are going to do it, and this is signed, so you do it. But it's not that important that you do it quick. So these also are things that one learns with time. Very good. So we have 32 answers now. Very interesting. Consent, confidentiality, consideration, human rights, protection. Very nice. I'm taking a screenshot of and saving what you have come up to. Human rights, protection, fairness, regulations, protect rights. I think it's very interesting what you have come up to, because it's a question of human rights. Our personal data is our right to keep it protected. So it's very good. Thanks for participating. I have. Do we have time for 2 more? No, I think I had another 2 questions prepared, but I think this one is very interesting enough, and we are already on the time of finishing. So thanks a lot for participating in the first day of the training school. If you have any more questions, also please don't hesitate of contacting me later by email, or also we are seeing each other in future classes. So again, it's possible to make more questions. I will stop the recording here. Stop recording.